Hello, I'm Conor McReynolds, and welcome to The Dinner Party. This is a brand new podcast where I interview a fantastic guest each week to learn all about their dream dinner party. I'll be finding out who they would invite, where they would host their party, and what they would cook for their esteemed guests. This week, I'm chatting to the fantastic Milo Edwards. Milo is a comedian, a writer, and a podcaster. I'm a really big fan of his. I've had the pleasure of gigging with Milo a few times, and he's consistently brilliant. I'm really looking forward to sitting down with Milo and learning all about the people that inspire him most. So here he is. This is the dream dinner party of Milo Edwards. So, Milo, hello. Thank you so much for joining me on episode 1 of the dinner party.
Hi, yeah, good. It's pleasure to be here.
How are you doing?
I'm all right, actually. You know, I'm kind of feeling. I was a bit hungover yesterday, but today I've done some yoga and I'm ready to podcast.
Oh my goodness. I beginning to think I should have had some kind of pre-podcast fitness regime that maybe would have made me more mentally agile for this.
It's all about the strength of body and mind podcasting. Yeah, Connor.
I have neither strength of body nor mind, so you might have to do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Milo, there's loads I want to talk to you about, but I want to start with you. You are. I love seeing you perform. You're such an interesting comedian. I want to go right back to like the very beginning of your sort of, not to sound too wanky, but comedic journey. You were part of the Cambridge Footlights, and I was speaking to Ben Pope a couple of weeks ago, lovely comedian on the Jericho podcast, and he was saying
nice
that
guy.
like the Footlights, he's a wonderful guy. He was saying that like being a part of the Footlights was quite a big motivation in applying to Cambridge. Is that the same for you? Do you think?
I think it was a bit. I think I kind of weirdly, I'd wanted to go to Cambridge since I was about 6 because I was an insufferable nerd. But as I got older, I probably considered Oxford a bit as well. But then I sort of I think because I was so interested in comedy, I was always more drawn to Cambridge because the comedians I liked at the time were all like Cambridge people, and I knew about the Footlights and the sort of mythology attached to it. But the weird thing about the Footlights is that most of the mythology attached to it doesn't really tell you anything about it, to be honest. Like the preconceptions you would have about it are not really what it's like at all. There are lots of things about it that are like very good and explain why it produces good comedians. But I think most of the associations people have with it, you'd be very surprised to actually see it in the flesh.
Okay. So what was your experience of it? I mean, how did it differ for you than what you'd sort of hoped it would be?
Well, I think I remember reading David Mitchell's autobiography a while ago, and he talked about the Footlights as this like incredibly collaborative thing where it's all like, you know, people writing together and like you're learning from older people and stuff like that. And part of my theory is that I think that I was in the Footlights at kind of the worst time. Like there were some nice people about, but it was definitely very like cliquey, and it had intensely like there were, you know, people kind of divided into very small groups, and so you'd write with maybe like 1 or 2 people, but the sensation was very much one of competing against everyone else. Like it was sort of not a very, I wouldn't describe it as like a super convivial atmosphere. But on the other hand, the amount which, I mean, in the sort of broader Cambridge comedy scene in general, the amount that you performed and the amount that you were encouraged to constantly have new material, partly by the way the Footlights shows ran, because they were one every 2 weeks and you had to have like a fresh 3-minute thing if you wanted to be in it, and hopefully more than one, which was partly the competitive aspect, like how many things you had in the smoker was always a bit of a... And so that encouragement of like writing turnover and sort of how experimental a lot of the stuff was very cool, and I think broadened a lot of people. The only downside of it, aside from the cliquiness, is kind of that I think the Footlights can lean towards quite a pretentious style of comedy. Like you sort of see, sometimes I'll do the Footlights show in Edinburgh that they do like a mixed bill stand-up and sketch show, and they give alumni spots on it sometimes. So I'll go and do that. It's a good way to promote your show. It's always sold out. And I sometimes look at, and I think I totally did this myself, but you look back on it now, you see like kind of comedians in their like second year at uni or whatever, and they're doing some incredibly esoteric bit that sort of it's getting a laugh because it's like a middle-aged people who've come to see the Cambridge Footlights at the Edinburgh Fringe. But I'm like, God, you could not do that in London. Like, Jesus Christ. Like, it does not set you up for victory on the London circuit. I'll tell you that.
That's so interesting. That is exactly what Ben Pope said of it as well, that it kind of exists in a bubble where you've got lots of very supportive audiences who are all kind of friends of the performers and stuff when you're in Cambridge. And then when you go to the kind of lion pit that is the London scene afterwards, nobody cares about you and nobody's nice.
No, exactly. They actively hate you usually.
Were you doing stand-up in the Footlights as well, Milo, or were you solely focused on sketch comedy there?
Well, that was a whole other thing, actually, because I've always been, well, I say always, but more or less since kind of the beginning of doing comedy at uni, I've been very focused on stand-up because when I was at school, I was very into sketch comedy because I was kind of into drama and stuff, but I was always into it in a comedic way, and so I really wanted to do sketches. But when I first showed up at Cambridge, I made lots of great friends, but I didn't make any friends who had any interest in doing comedy. And it turns out that those people were absolutely correct. Really made a much better decision than me. They all now have much happier lives. But so as a result of that, I couldn't really do sketches. You can't really do sketches on your own. I don't think you can even really write sketches on your own. So I kind of was like, well, I guess I'm a stand-up comedian then, and threw myself into doing that. And I think sort of I took stand-up more seriously than like the vast majority of people in the Footlights. A lot of people didn't do it at all. It is a very sketchy club. I mean, Ben was obviously big in stand-up, but I would say, yeah, probably of the Footlights kind of our generation, like Ben and I are sort of the only big stand-up people. Well, I don't know about big, but like stand-up people to have emerged as career stand-ups. Apart from, like, there's some people a bit older than us, like Phil and Pierre were obviously a bit older than us, but kind of from our year. Yeah. And I did do a lot of sketches a bit later on. I kind of, when I met more people through the club, and I did a lot of sketches kind of towards the end of my Cambridge career, but stand-up was always the one for me.
And so was stand-up something that started for you at Cambridge, or were you thinking about it before then?
Yeah, so I started at Cambridge initially. So there was a weird thing at the time. I don't think it's really the case anymore, but when I started doing stand-up at Cambridge, you had to audition to get any gigs whatsoever.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of died out a bit as time went on. But so all the gigs were auditioned. And that was really interesting. I mean, I hated it at the time, but I kind of realized I'd gotten through probably about 3 or 4 sets before I ever actually got a gig. And I realized that this kind of saved me from having a terrible gig.
Yeah.
Because I got through like my shittest material in these auditions, which were crushing experiences. But then after that, so then the first gig I had went really well. Which was kind of nice in a way. So maybe we should bring that back.
Wow, you were just being protected from yourself by your kind of comedy guardian angels. That sounds lovely. I wish someone had been there to do that for me. Milo, one thing you talk about a lot, I've seen you perform at Jericho Comedy a few times, and I love seeing you perform. You talk about your time living in Russia, which just sounds extraordinary. For any listeners who haven't had the pleasure of seeing you perform, can you tell us how you came to be a TV comic in Putin's Russia?
Well, that is a very good question, and I'm not sure it's one I've got a very good answer for. But I can give you the best explanation I have. Basically, how far back to go? When I was at Cambridge, one of my best friends was this guy, Vanya Gostev, right? I say that as though we're not still friends. We are still friends, but he was also my friend at the time. After a while, he suggested that I go and visit his family with him in Russia. And he was like, it'll be a crazy holiday, you'll enjoy it. And I remembered that before this, I kind of was like, right, I'm going to need to learn some Russian because Vanya is unreliable, and he still is, right? So I learned some Russian, and I got into all these kind of like mad scrapes while we were there and kind of muddling through them with my terrible phrasebook Russian. But it kind of got me a bit hooked on the experience of it because it is just an absolutely mental place. I can't really stress that enough. And we ended up going back there a number of times, and my Russian was kind of steadily improving. And I was like, oh, you know what? I'm just going to move here for like a bit as kind of a gap year after uni and see what happens. So I did that, and very much my intention was I'm going to have this kind of year out in Russia, make some money tutoring, and improve my Russian. That was sort of my plan, hang out with some friends, right? And I quickly discovered that I absolutely hate tutoring. I hated the people I was tutoring. And I was kind of escaping that by doing a bit of stand-up in English in this expat bar in Moscow. And at some point, after I've been living there about 4 or 5 months, these TV producers from TNT, which is kind of like their biggest entertainment network, came down to some show I was doing, came up to me after I had a chat with me in Russian. They were like, yeah, we really enjoyed your set. Take our card. Like, we're looking for comics for this new project that we're doing. And I'm like, okay, great. Now, the set had obviously been in English. They didn't speak any English whatsoever, I subsequently found out. So the whole nature... like, imagine a career based on that. A blind scouting.
That's amazing. They just liked the
yeah.
cut of your jib.
Exactly. And so kind of subsequent to that, this show they were doing, it was a bit like Last Comic Standing, like that sort of a format. But it was just their Russian version, so like Last Comic Left Alive. And it worked really well for me, I think, just because like to Russians, even the fact that a foreigner can speak Russian is absolutely mental. Like, they've not seen it before. Most expats you meet in Russia, and they're pretty few and far between these days, like, their Russian is terrible or non-existent. And so there was like, I had all these like huge degrees of intrigue. Like, I think I came over as like very establishment British to them. And so the idea that I would come and live in Russia was sort of bizarre and absurd. And I was making jokes about, you know, the kind of shit that I would see in Russia, but in a more Western style. I think that a lot of their stand-up is quite... I mean, it's advancing a lot now, but certainly at the time it was quite, like, kind of old-fashioned. And so I was kind of, like, sailing through this competition. I ended up coming second in the end, but that was enough to get me a job on this show, which is imaginatively called Stand-Up, which is their kind of, like, Live at the Apollo type format. Right, and I was never that massive, but it was like it was quite a fun time. I wouldn't describe it as a lucrative time, but it was quite fun.
It's mad, and because your comedy is often quite political, and does political comedy have any legs in Russia, or do those legs just get shot?
Well, that's actually a very interesting one. I think that political comedy in Russia basically doesn't exist. Not exactly because it's censored, but because there's kind of nothing to say. There's not really politics in Russia in the traditional sense. I mean, like, their political situation is obviously bad, but like,
yes.
There's no real like opposition. There's no real elections. Like, there's kind of like sort of the idea of there being politics is almost like a kind of a liberal democratic conception of how the world works. Like, you know, Russia has more of a system of just like, oh, what the fuck are you going to do? Like, that's kind of their approach to politics. They're like, yes, it is fucked, but it is also Russia. What did you expect? Like, that is how they kind of process that. And so as a result, you can, I would say on TV there, it's much easier. Like, live, you can do whatever you want, and you might get people who walk out, but like you won't get in trouble. On TV, they censor it a lot. It's mostly like kind of voluntary censorship. Like, it's not really the government censoring it. It's like the production company censors it, and then the TV company censors it more because they're all thinking about what the next guy's going to think.
Right.
So you never really get to the bottom of where the line actually is. But I would say that they're much more conservative with their censorship when it comes to social stuff. Like, they won't let you talk about drugs. They don't really like you talking about sex that much. Like, they try and like keep it quite like PG.
Why?
Whereas politics, they will actually let you make jokes about politics. I think because it's kind of acknowledged that it doesn't really matter. And there's a bit of a thing where like the people who love Putin are so mental that whatever joke you make about Putin, they will sort of assume that it's a pro-Putin joke. Like, I did a joke on TV there once that was like, that I was talking about like horrible Russian cafes, and I was like, you know, when you're served a piece of meat and you're not sure whether it's like chicken or beef, or the last guy that made a joke about Putin, and that made it onto TV, because I think that like the people who don't like Putin are like, oh yes, he murders people, and the people who love Putin are like, it's funny because he would never murder someone. Like, that's that's how they process that.
It sounds crazy. That really sounds nuts. Like, how did that experience, that kind of whole experience of writing for Russian audiences and living and kind of experiencing that culture, how did it change your outlook to comedy then when you came back to the UK?
I think that I learned a lot in Russia in terms of doing comedy as a practice. I think because I would divide my sort of comedy career into these stages where I think Cambridge like really like broadened me a lot, as well as giving me the fundamentals of it. It really gave me a sense of being interesting, being important, and like that was something I will always credit the Footlights with, at least in that generation of the club, was they were always encouraging you to do the weirdest possible thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I had this, like, the bit that other Footlights used to quote back at me at mine was a bit where I was talking about an assisted suicide storyline in Coronation Street, where the tabloid press were describing the woman in concerned as taking a cocktail of lethal drugs, and I do an act out of imagining what that scene was like, having never seen it, and I do this like really elaborate cocktail shaking at like while I'm saying goodbye to my husband. With like bar flare and stuff, like that kind of like really weird shit, right? And then in Russia, I would say that was kind of a stage of my career where it was like learning sort of arch professionalism, because the TV there was, they didn't like interesting, but what they did like was 8 minutes of impossibly tight material.
Right.
Like, you couldn't really get away with the slightest bit of a throwaway line with them. They were kind of to the point where it almost made the comedy worse. Like, you couldn't really have light and shade. Like, they wanted there to be like laughs every 10 seconds consistently, and if that wasn't there, then you needed to rewrite it.
That's crazy. So, do you think when you came back to the UK, then that sort of those demands kind of benefited your writing here?
I think so. Yeah, because I mean, so we have a joke amongst me, and there are a few like good friends of mine who are still comedians on the TV there. Generally speaking, like most people there I got on with, but there were like one or two people who I felt were like proper comedians rather than kind of like TV clowns. And I'm still in touch with those people. They're really good guys. And we always used to moan about the editor on the station. It was this guy called Yegor, because you'd go into Yegor and he would just tell you that all of your jokes were shit, and then he would suggest an idea that you would then write, and then he would come back. You'd go back there the next week, and he would tell you that your other jokes were actually all right, but this new joke that you'd written, which was his idea, was shit, and he doesn't understand why you put it in there. Like that kind of thing. But there was one thing that Yegor always used to say, which to start with annoyed me because he said so many other things which were annoying. But this thing that he said was actually, I think, is the best bit of stand-up criticism that you can give yourself. You'd sit down and you'd be analysing a joke that had unimpeachably worked in the room, like a 30-second to 2-minute bit that people were laughing at, right? Mm-hmm. And then he would turn to you and he would say, "Ощущение, что она недобитая," which is like, it feels like it's not written yet. And then I'd be like, "What do you mean?" And he'd be like, "It's not finished." I'd be like, "What do you mean it's not finished?" And he's like, finish it. And then it took me a while to really understand what this meant. But I've realized that most people, they don't really explore a premise sufficiently. They explore the premise until they get a laugh, and then they stop. Whereas what you really want is, if you've got like a 30-second or 2-minute, whatever, a shortish like premise bit, you should try and make it a 10-minute bit, and it'll probably be a shit 10-minute bit, but then you can probably shrink it back down to like 4 minutes, and it will be a much better bit than it was originally. And so these bits used to go through these like horrible like mutational phases where they would work less well, but eventually they would shrink back down to something that was much better and much more satisfying. And now I kind of naturally write in that way more, whereas I watch other people's sets sometimes and I'm like, this is like, you've just said an idea and you've not said anything about it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's a very good lesson to learn in terms of your writing. Oh man, Milo, there's so much I want to talk to you about. But I kind of am also dying to get to the very premise of this podcast. So I should probably, 20 minutes into episode 1 of the dinner party, actually ask you about your dream dinner party before we find out who would be going, what you'd be cooking, and where it would be. First of all, I want to kind of ask you, in terms of dinner parties that you've been to or dinner parties that you would like to host, what's the vibe you're going for? Is it a kind of sophisticated conversational affair, or do you want it to be a bit boozier, a bit more raucous?
Wow, it really depends, doesn't it? I mean, I don't mind either actually. But for me, like, centerpiece of a good dinner party is definitely good food. I don't like going to a dinner party at people's houses where they can't really cook that well. You know, people who think they can cook but they can't really cook. Like, I don't care for that. Like, if I'm cooking a dinner party, it's a serious affair, right? And so I think probably the ideal is one that starts more civilized and descends into a boozier on a kind of on a gradual sort of tapering. I think that's really the ideal.
That is the dream. I like that. And I think, knowing the guests that you've invited along, I think you're well set up for that structure of an evening. I think you'll get some really interesting conversation at the start, and by the end, who knows where it would be. So, Milo, you can choose anywhere in the world to host your dream dinner party. Where on planet Earth, or even beyond, do you want to host your party?
Well, that is a very good question. I mean, I feel like the best place really to host a dinner party is in your house, right? I feel like that is that you've got to be like king of your own domain.
Yeah.
And speaking as someone who doesn't really have his own house, I don't know. in a hypothetical house that I own, can part of the fantasy be that I own a house?
Yeah, that we're of a generation that can afford a house. I think that is by far and away the largest fantasy aspect of this podcast so far. Well, where would you like this house to be? Describe to us what it would look like, where it would be, what the kind of setting would be for your party.
Well, I think again, for a good dinner party, I am not good at timing food. Like, I make good food, but I'm not, I am going to be in and out of the kitchen. So you really want your open plan kitchen diner setup.
Nice.
Actually, I used to have a rich girlfriend, and we had an apartment in Whitechapel, which I was not paying for, but which had it was like a kind of loft type thing, but it had this huge kind of kitchen diner living area with like a kind of like 12-foot long table in it, which was I would say the best place I've hosted a dinner party so far. Sort of light area space, high ceiling, big table. You don't want to be squeezed around a small table. That's terrible.
No, you want a little bit of elbow room. Well, that sounds great. Maybe we could get your ex-girlfriend out of the apartment for a night and you could host it there.
Well, the dream, the ultimate.
I think episode 1, I think that might also be the last time in this series I get anyone saying, I'd love to host it at my ex's apartment. But it does sound like a really
I don't think
excellent
she still
place.
lives there either. But maybe we could convince the people who do. That would be easier than convincing my ex, I think.
I'll have a word with her. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
All right.
She'll see
well,
sense.
We know where it would be. The table's set, and Milo, your first guest is about to arrive. Tell us, why are you inviting Steve Coogan?
Well, I think so. As this develops, we're going to see that a lot of the guests I've invited for very different reasons, and I think that, and some guests I've invited because I'm deeply intrigued by what they're going to say, and some guests I've invited because I like them, and some guests I've invited to improve the overall vibe of the dinner party.
Interesting.
Because I mean, like this is an intellectual exercise, but like really an ideal dinner party would be people presumably. So you've got to kind of delicately tune the atmosphere of a dinner party of people you don't know. So Steve Coogan is someone who I for my money is kind of one of the greatest British comedy writers, I think.
Yeah.
It's almost like Steve Coogan is at any dinner party I host, given the amount me and my friends quote Alan Partridge to each other. So in that sense, I feel like he would spiritually really fit in with the dynamic. But I kind of get the impression that like a lot of people don't like Steve Coogan because I think he comes over as a bit of a knob, but he comes over as like the kind of knob that I would get along with. Like I think Steve Coogan and I are a bit of a knob in the same way. And so I feel like we could get on.
I kind of know what you mean. Like, one of the questions I wanted to ask was, like, do you think he would actually thrive in a dinner party setting? Because he seems sometimes quite intense, but then maybe that's because when he's not Alan Partridge, the only time you ever really see Steve Coogan is when he's complaining about his phone being hacked, and that's kind of an appropriate setting to be intense. But how do you think he would get on at a dinner party? Do you think he would be a laugh?
I think so. I have this theory about, because there's that whole thing about like, well, lots of comedians aren't funny in real life. Yeah. And I sort of think like, well, that's sort of true, but like the funny comedians are always funny in real life. You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like with people. That's just because like lots of comedians who aren't funny somehow still exist, but like the ones who are like people who are actually funny, they're funny in real life, right? Yeah, so I think that I think that Steve Coogan would be funny, but I think I know what you mean about the intensity. I think that he's kind of, but I don't think he's intense in a shy way. I think he would just lead the conversation down an intense path, which is
Yeah.
sometimes fun. Sort of depends. Depending on, well, as we get to the other guests, that could well come in.
It certainly could, and he's also kind of fairly outspoken politically as well, and that's something that I would kind of associate with you too. So, would you be relying
Mm.
on kind of a good opportunity for some in-depth political chat with Steve Coogan?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think that I definitely think that me and Steve Coogan kind of share a politics, which would probably help. I would like. I'm not one of these people who like I have to. I can only associate with people who have the same politics as me. I think people who say that are a bit disingenuous, really. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can't really associate with people who are like really political in the opposite direction because they'll just wind me up. Like, so
Sure.
if I can have friends who just don't care about politics, that's fine. So yeah, I probably wouldn't invite any sort of like arch right wing nutcases, but I'm not. You know, it doesn't really bother me if someone has a bit of a quiet view that differs.
Sure, a kind of socially pleasant right winger is acceptable if they have a good story.
Exactly. Yeah, like some right wingers, very entertaining. Like, you know, someone like Jeremy Clarkson. Do I agree with him about almost anything? No. Is he very entertaining? Yes.
Well, let's have Clarkson on the B list for your dinner party. Hopefully, he doesn't
Yeah,
quite make
a
the A
sub dinner
list.
party occurring at a worse apartment.
One where your ex is still in the apartment, and then Clarkson's there.
You know what? Actually, what you should do is your worst dinner party. That
Oh,
would be
that
really
is
revealing.
that is brilliant. That is absolutely fantastic. We are going to make that a thing in the podcast. I can have you back to describe your nightmare dinner party in another episode. I would love that so much.
Yeah, it's just me and a load of people I know from university.
Milo, what's your first memory then of being a fan of Steve Coogan's? I mean, you mentioned Partridge. Was that something you watched growing up?
No, I kind of came to Partridge a bit later in life. I'm trying to think. I got into it maybe as a teenager. Maybe I was about
Mhm.
16, 17, something like that. Or I can't really remember precisely, but I remember by the time that I was at uni, I was already a massive Alan Partridge fan because I recall that in first year, me and some other people who did classics we'd sort of bonded a bit over the fact that we already liked Alan Partridge, and we thought it would be a great idea to engage in an Alan Partridge drinking game at one of our flats, and we'd come up with the rules of like when you had to drink when X, Y, or Z thing happened in Alan Partridge. Turns out we've been a bit over enthusiastic because we were drinking pretty much constantly. I think we blacked out somewhere in episode 2 of season 1, and I genuinely have no idea how much further than that we watched. Desperately ill the next day, so that's something I could discuss with Steve Coogan, perhaps.
I think that would be a very good thing. In fact, that was my next question. What is it that you want to ask him about or talk to him about?
Well, I think in a professional sense, I think what most interests me about Steve Coogan is like how well observed Alan Partridge is. And I mean, I think sort of Alan Partridge in all of his iterations, if you like, be it the show or the Knowing Me, Knowing You and the older stuff. There's something about Alan Partridge where it's like everyone knows a guy who is like Alan Partridge in Britain, right? Like Alan Partridge is so sort of beautifully idiomatic. Like he kind of conjures like a symbiosis of like a dad that you've bumped into in B&Q who's like trying to build himself a drinks cabinet or something. Like it's that beautiful, because there's something like incredibly it's like there's such a complexity to Alan Partridge where he's simultaneously awful and an idiot, but he also is like smarter and more moral than most people he comes into contact with. So you sort of root for him in this. He has this kind of energy about him where you sort of sympathise with his viewpoint. He's a little bit like Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm in that way, like the guy who's always in the wrong but is on some level right.
Yeah, exactly. I'm literally watching Curb for the first time through. I'm up to like season 9 now. And yes,
Oh, wow.
despite how dreadful he is, you're absolutely right about Partridge and about Larry David. You're still kind of rooting for them. You're still on their side. it is such an achievement in writing. Have you ever had the chance to see Steve Coogan kind of performing live or anything like that? I know he did a tour a few years ago. Have you ever had the pleasure of seeing him?
No, I know I never have actually.
Oh, that's the dream. Well, if he's at your dinner party, you would get the chance
Wow,
to see him there. Let's try to make
could
this
do, yeah.
happen.
Just doing bits from the trip.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite impression of Steve Coogan's that he does on the trip? Do you have one that you kind of think is his pièce de
Ooh.
résistance?
Well, I mean, the Michael Caine bit is obviously astonishing. Because
Isn't it incredible in that bit that they're both accurate? They're both so right, he and Rob Brydon, and they're so different.
Well, I think that is the beauty of a impression. Is that an impression is basically a caricature.
Yeah.
There's an American comedian I quite like called Nick Mullen who has he has a theory about impressions, which is much easier to do an impression of someone once there's like a good established impression of that person, because it takes a good impressionist to kind of look at the way someone talks and draw out of that what the mannerism, what the bits you're going to accentuate are, because you can't completely imitate someone's voice. That's sort of absurd. You have to kind of get enough of it, the key bits, the bits that really stand out, to kind of get over a good impression. And so they're both picking out different aspects, because with Michael Caine there's so much going on. Well, Michael Caine, it's the flat voice, but also the nasal part. But then that bit where, is it Steve Coogan who takes it back to the no, in the 1960s, and he gets that much more, that kind of like younger man voice, and it's it's just such a beautiful, like a whole like 50 years of different Michael Caines.
That's incredible. That would just be an interesting show, just to watch Steve Coogan, the kind of the evolution of Michael Caine's voice. I would watch that for an hour.
Yeah. I love doing impressions, but the people I can do impressions of are just such a weird mixture, and I don't know why. Like, I can do a really good Brian Cox, but I can't explain why. I don't think about Brian Cox.
Will you treat us to a little Brian Cox?
I don't know why I can do this impression so well, but it's amazing, isn't it? When you look up at the stars and you think, why am I talking in this voice? But it really gives you a sense of perspective on the kinds of weirdos that we let on TV.
I love Robin Ince's bit where he starts doing an impression of Brian Cox and it kind of turns into Alan Bennett. Have you seen this?
Oh, Alan Bennett. My Alan Bennett's not as good, but I could do a generic Bennett. The everyman Bennett.
Next time you're at Jericho, we just need you to do a little kind of 10-minute impression set. That's what the people want to see.
I did that once in my indulgent days at Cambridge, but I'm not sure I could get away with it on the circuit. Yeah, I did some whole bit where it was like Colin Farrell and Roger Moore were on a warship, and Colin Farrell was I can't remember how I got to there was some sort of conceptual explanation for why, like the scenario where Colin Farrell is the captain of a Royal Navy warship and he doesn't like it, and Roger Moore's there for some reason, and I'm acting out this conversation between Colin Farrell and Roger Moore, doing impressions of both of them. My Colin Farrell is better than my Roger Moore because Roger Moore's voice is impossibly deep. Colin Farrell, the thing about Colin Farrell is he talks really fucking fast. Okay, that's not good. We're on a warship here. It's not a fucking laughing matter, right? Roger Moore. He's like, why am I always having sex? Well, Roger Moore by name.
That is a fantastic Roger Moore. And speaking of Roger Moore, he is guest number 2 at your dinner party. So you've got your impression. You were writing material about him at uni. Are you a lifelong fan of Roger Moore?
Oh, I really am. Like the Bond films that I really loved as a kid were the Roger Moore ones and the Pierce Brosnan ones. Still, I like the Craig Bond films. I really don't like the Sean Connery ones. I felt Sean Connery too much of a knob, and it comes across. I like. There's something about, and I think that the attempts to make the Bond films gritty have been like slightly misguided. In that I feel like the real soul of the Bond film is in the Roger Moore ones because they're completely absurd. Like, it's a guy getting laid in space. Like, that is fundamentally what James Bond is about. Like, it's a completely stupid and facile idea, but it's fun to watch, right? And there's something about, like, there's a certain charm to Roger Moore, which is I just think like what a ridiculously cool man. Like that
Yeah.
is I am envious of the kind of just sort of like very very kind of devil may care but simultaneously extremely gentlemanly energy that Roger Moore exudes. But there's a story about Roger Moore that I once heard which absolutely cemented his status as a Stone Bonker legend. When Roger Moore died, there was this tweet about him that went viral from some guy who works at UNICEF, and he said, "When I was a kid, I was in Nice airport, and I was about 9 years old, or perhaps younger, like 6 or 7 or something. He was with his granddad, right? And he recognised Roger Moore, but obviously recognised him as James Bond, and his granddad didn't know who it was, right? And so he goes like, "That man over there, that's James Bond, And then so he kept going on about it. So his granddad goes over there and gets his autograph, comes back with this autograph that's signed Roger Moore. And this guy's like, no, his name's not Roger Moore, it's James Bond. So he sends his granddad back over there, who like explains this to Roger Moore, who then comes back over and says to the kid, he's like, well, of course, my name really is James Bond, but I can't be just writing that anywhere. Blofeld's men could be anywhere, right? Which is like a fine story, right? But it gets better because years later, when this guy's an adult, he's running some sort of charity event for UNICEF, and Roger Moore's coming in to do a photo shoot with them, right? So they're having a chat in the meeting, and he says to Roger Moore, like, oh, you probably don't remember this, but when I was a kid, and he tells the story. And Roger Moore goes like, oh, no, I don't remember, but that is quite a nice story. And then, so they do this whole day of shooting, whatever. He's like leaving for the day. And while he's on his way out of the building, he bumps into Roger Moore in the corridor, who just sort of grabs him by the elbow and goes, by the way, of course I remember that story, but I couldn't say anything in there. Any one of them could be working for Blofeld.
Oh, that is brilliant.
Absolutely incredible. 10 out of 10. What a man.
Oh, what a great guy. When he's there, are you asking him solely about Bond, or are you kind of asking about his UNICEF work as well, and the Saint? Because he's such an interesting life, such an interesting career.
Yeah, like a storied. I feel like it's not so much that I want to ask Roger Moore things, as I just feel like it would be a pleasure to be in Roger Moore's company.
Yes,
I think
you just want to be around him.
Yeah, I feel like Roger Moore would have great stories. I don't really know what the stories would necessarily be about, but I am convinced that like Roger Moore is just going to come out with some absolute hits when it comes to telling a story.
Yeah, he would be absolutely fantastic. I bet he and Steve Coogan would have great banter as well between them.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's the other thing about Roger Moore is I think that Roger Moore would engender the kind of vibe that you want at a dinner party. You need some sort of raconteurs in the mix who can sort of more or less get on with anyone, which I think is kind of his energy.
Yeah. He is he's such a cool guy. I mean, he's such a brilliant Bond. And obviously, you mentioned kind of Daniel Craig and that kind of thing. You're a big Bond fan. There is a gap in the market after Daniel Craig goes. Could Milo Edwards be the next Bond?
Yeah, maybe I could. Maybe that would be an interesting career move for me, wasn't it? Maybe
What
like a sort of.
You try to bring it back to more of a kind of Roger Moore era vibe, yeah.
It would have to be with me, I think. I can't play the serious hard man. I don't know if you've ever looked at me in the flesh, but I mean, this is like a for those who haven't. I wouldn't describe myself as an intimidating man. I'm moderately tall, but I'm hardly a brick shithouse, right? Like I can't pull off the sort of Daniel Craig, smoldering aggression vibe.
Sure.
It would have to be more of a slightly comedic, I can't really act either. I think all I can really do is play myself in a sort of absurd manner.
I think for Bond, so long as you're holding a martini and you're wearing a tux, that's kind of enough for Bond. If you look the part, you're kind of sorted. It's interesting that you talk about the sort of the physicality of Bond. I was looking up, trying to find out little interesting facts about each of your guests. Steve Coogan's just so infuriatingly private. I couldn't really find anything for Coogan. But for Roger Moore, there were a couple of little things that I thought were quite fun. So he never ran on screen because he thought he looked awkward. So every single time in Roger Moore's career that you see him running in a film, that's a stunt double. He never ran on camera. And the other thing was that Sir Roger suffered from hoplophobia, which is a fear of firearms, which is an extraordinary fear for James Bond to have.
That's amazing.
Uh,
Maybe
so
that's
you'd
like
have
a sort of philosopher king thing, you know, like the only person you can trust with a firearm is the man who's most afraid of it.
There's something profound in there that we need to get to the root of. Uh,
Mm.
but yeah, well, it's interesting, of course. Sir Roger Moore, scared of firearms. Your next guest then might present
Okay.
something of a challenge to that fear of Sir Roger. Milo, your third dream dinner party guest is Osama bin Laden.
100%. This was genuinely the first name I came up with. Like, to some extent, I had kind of struggled coming up with the names. But Osama bin Laden was straight off the bat. I didn't even need to think about it.
This guy, he's bringing all the laughs.
Oh, yeah. Do you know what? I reckon he actually is, but we'll get to that. So, Osama bin Laden, I think if Osama bin Laden isn't on your dream dinner party list, you have fundamentally missed an opportunity, right? Because Osama bin Laden is one of the few people that could genuinely unravel for you a lot of the absolute fuckery that has taken place in the last 40 years. Because, like, you could, you know, I bet a lot of people would say something like Barack Obama or whatever. Like, he's a charming man, but you're going to get pure bullshit from him. You're not going to get any actual truth out of Barack Obama. You're going to get platitudes and the odd funny story, right? No good. Bin Laden is going to tell you what actually fucking happened, right? Okay. I mean, I've done this as a bit actually, but like for my money, 9/11 is the most incredible thing that ever happened, right? No one has created like a piece of art or something that even compares in scale to 9/11
It's true.
in terms of
That is true.
Yeah. I mean, if someone had crashed one plane into one tallest building in the world, you'd think that's mental. But two into two on the same day is incredible, right? Like there's a level of spectacle in that act of terror, which is just, I don't think we'll see it again, genuinely. You look at the video and it doesn't even look real. That's how mad it is. And I think that kind of bin Laden as someone who was sort of at the center of like all of the weird foreign spy shit surrounding the Mujahideen in the 80s, and then how he sort of fell out with the CIA in the 90s, and then Al Qaeda and all that kind of thing, I think is sort of he's kind of a fascinating guy. And then, is it wrong to say I miss Al Qaeda? Like, I think, like you get kind of like something like people like ISIS. They're like real like Philistine terrorists, whereas Al Qaeda, most of the like leaders of Al Qaeda just had like just a real legitimate grudge against the West. They weren't quite like barbarians in the same way. I mean, they obviously did a lot of terrible things, but like there's a sort of there was almost a gentleman terrorist vibe about Al Qaeda, which is kind of gone now.
You think they kind of had a code that they lived by, whereas ISIS are a bit too wild card? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think they were kind of, I think like, you know, Al Qaeda was sort of making a point, whereas ISIS are more just like kind of bloodbaths for their own sake. Like,
Just, yeah.
because I think sort of like 9/11 is like it's deeply making a point, right? It's kind of it's something that like it's etched on the psyche. It's not like if you wanted to kill a lot of people, there are other things you could do, but there's something about the spectacle of it that sort of appeals to Al Qaeda. I think that's kind of the but I think that there's also because all the like Bin Laden, it's like his dad was like a multi-millionaire sort of construction magnate. He comes from like a very upper class family, and he kind of got into it through this like Afghan freedom fighting stuff. And then, well, as I understand it, he basically had a falling out with the CIA, which basically involved like them murdering some of his family in a sort of botched attempt to get rid of him. So like my theory about Bin Laden is that he just has like a deeply personal grudge against the American government.
That is very interesting. I can almost picture the kind of gritty superhero origin movie of kind of they came for his family. It's
he made
it's really...
a videotape.
I mean, a lot of the usual questions that I kind of be inclined to ask about dinner party guests just don't apply here. You know, like what qualities do you think Osama would bring to the party? But you're convincing me here. Like he, okay, morally reprehensible, but you can't deny that he'd be interesting.
Yeah, and I think that as someone with like a lot of terrorists, right? They're either nuts or they're just kind like I think they'd be quite boring. Like like someone like Abu Hamza, right? Nuts. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, nuts and boring. Whereas Bin Laden, he has this kind of like academic energy to him. Like I think that Bin Laden would be like a genuinely interesting conversationist. Like I don't think Bin Laden is like a moralist or a prude in a way that like a lot of terrorists are. I mean, well, moralists about certain things, obviously. I think Bin Laden is like would be quite a cool dinner party energy. Like I think Bin Laden's got a few funny stories. Like I wouldn't put it past him.
He's certainly an edgy guest. Like, people are hearing about this dinner party and they want to be at your next dinner party. I think he adds definitely a level of mystique to a dinner party. And again,
you had
like
to be there for that story he told about the suicide bomber who wanted a practice run.
Like when it came to looking up interesting facts, again, there was nothing like, Osama bin Laden masterminded the September 11th attacks. But did you know he also won Celebrity Master Chef in his native Saudi Arabia? Like, there's just nothing. Do you know of anything about him that you think is particularly fascinating? One area of his life, or the things that led him to 9/11. Is there a particular thing you want to ask him about and want to know about?
Well, I think Osama bin Laden has a very interesting sort of origin story because so his family are, I believe, they're Yemeni Saudis, and his father was extremely rich, and he has like 10 siblings or something, and they grew up mostly in Sweden, I think. Like it's really like his life story is like really peculiar because like there's one of his brothers lives in the US. And it's like it's funny because like, all of his siblings are like very normal, like establishment people, basically, because they're all wealthy, like Saudi emigres, basically.
Yeah.
And so it's very like, and they were like by all accounts like a very sort of like liberal family, like they weren't especially religious or and so it's. I think the origin story of Osama bin Laden is really interesting, and I think a lot of people don't know much about him, kind of because of the nature of the life that he led. But I reckon that would be an interesting thing to get to the bottom of. And also, of course, if he really did do 9/11, I want to check. if he was fitted up, I want to get it from the horse's mouth.
Because Alex Jones is definitely listening to this and thinking, no, it was Obama. Obama did it. So yeah, it would be nice to have someone else just confirm, just to someone to say, yeah, sorry lads, it was me. Sorry, mea culpa.
Well, I always think it must really annoy Bin Laden when he watches those, because he had when they raided his house, on his computer he had several 9/11 conspiracy documentaries, and so I don't know if was he watching those like in pure rage that he wasn't getting full credit for like his greatest ever achievement.
That I did not know that. That is incredible. I am now 100% convinced that Osama bin Laden would be a wonderful dinner party guest, and.
That's
that
right.
is a sentence I never thought I would say. That is incredible. Moving away from the warlord, we talked earlier about your experience in the Cambridge Footlights, and your fourth guest is another former Footlight. You are inviting the wonderful Miriam Margoyles.
Yeah, I think this is a bit of an interesting guest in the sense that he says that after Miriam Margolyes and not after Osama bin Laden. Sure, some people might think this one's a bit controversial. I don't know a huge amount about Miriam Margolyes, but I have come to the impression that Miriam Margolyes is extremely entertaining as company.
Yes,
because. I'm not really someone who watches a lot of chat shows, but my mum sometimes watches the Graham Norton show. Graham Norton will quite often have Miriam Margolyes on there for ostensibly no reason, right? But the reason becomes clear. It's because there are a bunch of like prudish Hollywood actors on there. Because I mean, America's a weird place. It was founded by Puritans. Americans have a very bad relationship with like humor and borediness in general, and so I just have this vivid memory of P. Diddy, who's like sitting there. I think it was P. Diddy sitting there in his sunglasses, trying to look cool, and Miriam Margolyes like really just like seriously explaining to him that the trouble with doing cunnilingus is you sometimes get pubes stuck in your teeth, and then doing an act out of what it's like trying to pull a pube out of your front teeth. And him just like being like, who is this bitch? And that is the kind of behavior that I have the utmost respect for. I think like she can be nothing but an excellent vibe at a dinner party.
Who'd have thought that at this dinner party, the wild card isn't Bin Laden? She is absolutely fascinating. You're right, and she is so candid, and it's just hilarious every time. She has absolutely no filter. Is that the kind of the energy you want her to bring? You want her to bring a little bit of shock value to the party?
I think so. I think people like that are good because they add they set a high bar for like where the high watermark of banter is. They sort of because I think people in a social situation, people quickly adjust to whatever they think the norms of the room that they're in are. I think most people who aren't kind of like deeply devoid of social skills kind of operate a bit as social chameleons. Like you can be very different in different groups, right? And so if you sprinkle in a couple of people who are just going to go in hard with some big opinions, like that really it raises the bar for like people feel like they've got some breathing space to kind of be a bit more interesting.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a dinner party that's dominated by boring people, they're going to make everyone else more boring.
That's interesting. So someone like Miriam just kind of widens the edges of what's permissible.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Again, Miriam, she's another very political person, like Coogan, and to a different extent, Bin Laden. But
Yeah.
Miriam, very political.
One could describe him as political.
I feel that if he wasn't political before, he sort of became political at least.
Not many people know that he once ran as a Lib Dem councillor in Stoke.
He stood against Farage in the
he's really passionate about bin
election.
collections in his early career.
But Miriam, she's very political as well. Are you kind of au fait with her politics? Do you sort of roughly know what her politics are?
I get the sense that she has quite lefty politics because I am in Equity, the performers union, and she's often undersigned on the more radical suggestions. So I've kind of assumed I don't know much about her politics particularly, but I get the impression they're fairly left.
Yes, yeah, no, I think that is absolutely correct. She's very interesting. I mean, she speaks in an area that I, as a very ignorant Irish Catholic, know very little about, but she's Jewish, but she's very critical of Israel, and that's something that she's quite outspoken about. And I think that there are certain aspects or certain people of Jewish faith who feel that you've got to be very supportive of everything that Israel does, and Miriam Margolyes doesn't subscribe to that, and she speaks very interestingly on it. It's not something I can speak about with any level of authority, but she's really fascinating when I think you've got a brilliant guest here in that she does have these really hilarious, outlandish, shocking stories, but also she by the sides of things a really fascinating person.
Yeah, I think so, and I think what you were saying is very true. That I think it's. I'm friends with quite a few like very left wing Jews, and it's quite difficult being a left wing Jew because there are because simultaneously the way in which Israel is run is very bad and does a lot of terrible things, but also a lot of the reasons why a lot of people so frantically oppose Israel are quite cranky and also a bit anti-Semitic. So it's it's a difficult. I think they find themselves trapped a bit between a rock and a hard place of kind of anti-Semites and then kind of a more right-wing, often sort of establishment in parts of the Jewish community, which views any criticism of Israel as being sort of inherently anti-Semitic. I think it's a bit difficult to square that circle. So they definitely have my every sympathy.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think you would be able to have a very frank and honest discussion with Miriam Margolyes on that area, and I think it's something she would really enjoy.
I think it would be mostly about pubes. That would be. I would prefer, rather than bringing everyone down with the horrible political conundrum of being a left-wing Jew. I think pubes would be a better discussion topic.
Well, I think that's a very fair point. My little interesting fact about Sandy Toxvig, or sorry, about Miriam Margolyes, was that she was offered the opportunity to replace Sandy Toxvig on the Great British Bake Off, but she turned it down, saying, "I can't think of anything I would rather do less than be in a room with a frying pan and a saucepan. I'm not interested in cooking. I love being asked to supper, but to have anything to do with the preparation, it's kind of them to think of me, but no." So I like your chances of getting her
There
to this dinner party. She likes being invited to supper.
you go. Maybe I should start inviting her to things and just see if she turns up. Miriam,
Oh, I
listen, Bin
mean,
Laden's
you
going to be
throw
there.
enough of that out there, something's got to stick. Just invite her to
There's another guest who's
everything
also
you
quite
do.
critical of Israel. Perhaps
Well,
from a
Milo,
slightly different perspective.
your final dream guest is a cracking choice, and it's one I'm not entirely surprised by. Do you want to tell us who is your fifth and final dream dinner party guest?
My final guest is Stuart Lee,
Brilliant
who
choice.
is in some ways my most boring choice, but it was kind of a choice I had to make.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think boring at all. I mean, he's someone who just seems to have, at the very least, a perfunctory knowledge of almost everything in existence. So he
Mm.
would be fascinating. When did you first become a Stuart Lee fan?
I think when I was at university, I would say I sort
Mhm.
of I think when I first started watching stand up a lot, I didn't really like Stuart Lee because I think
Yes!
I found it a bit sort of pretentious or maybe a little
I am
bit.
so glad you said that because when I first watched Stuart Lee, I just didn't get it. And I thought he was a dick.
Yeah, and then now like Stuart Lee is now by far my favorite comedian to the extent that when I
Mhm.
talk about having favorite comedians, almost Stuart Lee is the only person I mention. Like I don't
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of so much, and I think this is why I sort of empathize with the Stuart Lee thing all the more, which is that I think for me, I have a sort of personality type where the more I know about something, the more I hate almost every example of it. Like I've kind of like the way in which Stuart Lee talks about like other famous comedians to me is I'm like, yeah, it's shit, isn't it? Like everything, like most comedy that's on television or wherever else, I just watch it and I'm like, this is crap. And I
Yeah.
understand why it appeals to a mass audience because a mass audience, which used to be me, hasn't spent years developing like a discerning fucking palate for comedy, which like most people have no need of whatsoever. Like all those people who know loads about wine for no reason. Like it just means you have to spend more on wine to get the same enjoyment. um, and so yeah, now like if a comedy bit isn't about like why 9/11 was good, I'm like, bit middle of the road.
That's such a good point. So, you're inviting Stuart Lee. I want to know, are you inviting Stuart Lee or are you inviting the character Stuart Lee?
Ah, well, that's an interesting distinction. Well, I think that the real Stuart Lee is sort of a bit like the character Stuart Lee, but the character is like an exaggerated version. But I think
Mhm.
you want the real person because you want the kind of the intricacies of it. You want to
Yeah,
understand
yeah.
the thinking. I think one of the things I really like about Stuart Lee, whenever you see him speak as a person rather than as the sort of
Mhm.
persona Stuart Lee, is that he is a bit unapologetically intellectual, and I think that being an intellectual is out of fashion partly because a lot of people who style themselves as intellectuals are awful and stupid. And there's kind of a like I think particularly Britain is a country that we love a moron and we hate an intellectual. One of the
Yeah.
first phrases my Cockney grandmother taught me as a child was too clever by half, and I've never really understood that phrase. It's like the idea that you could be too clever to be is kind of mad. Um, and I think a lot of the negatives that people associate with being clever are just negatives they associate more with just like arrogance, right? And that people are
Yeah, yeah.
falsely. But I think that sort of Stuart Lee. I think I'm someone probably who, in my deepest, darkest moments, have sort of pretensions to being a bit intellectual, and so I really like that, and I'm very like I think Stuart Lee has like interesting opinions about things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I see similarities between some qualities of your stand up and Stuart Lee's because they are both quite cerebral. Do you think that's fair? Like you deal with
Yeah, I
some.
think it's a compliment.
I absolutely. I'm glad you did. I was worried that that might come across as me saying that you're snooty or arrogant, which is absolutely not what I was saying at all. But you talk about language a lot in your stand up, and you talk about literature quite a bit in your stand up. And I
Mm.
think that those are very much areas that I think a typical Stuart Lee audience would enjoy as well. Would you like
Yeah,
to have the opportunity to kind of go over material with Stuart Lee? Do you think that would be fun?
I'd love to talk about the theory of doing it with Stuart Lee. Like
Hmm.
I sort of material itself. I don't mind. I'd love to do a riff with Stuart Lee. We'd love to riff. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that there's a certain theory of doing things, and the longer I do stand up, the more I kind of work out what I'm about. And I think kind of what you've picked up on there about sort of cerebral stuff and linguistic stuff is partly key to it. I think a lot of a lot of my bits either hinge on two things. I love to do things that are like either here is a really mental opinion that you're gonna hate, but you will agree with it by the end of this bit, or it's like I love doing the sacred and the profane, like somehow doing like a really in-depth academic analysis of something that's profoundly stupid but that isn't about but is really about something else. Like I was writing a show before lockdown for Edinburgh, which is kind of now lain dormant, but I had a bit
Mm.
that I was really enjoying working on about how MILFs are, and the age at which you can become a MILF is basically indicative of the greater economic malaise of the millennial generation. Um, and it's just explicitly about MILFs and like about what the categories are to become a MILF and whether those are in the reach of people who will never own a home and so on. And it just becomes sort of very sort. But I love that marrying together like a kind of academic or pseudo academic sort of economic analysis of something with something incredibly stupid like the concept of a MILF.
That sounds really, really fun. And I think absolutely what you're saying, that's a quality that Stuart Lee has a lot, like talking about crisps or talking
Mm.
about, yeah, I mean, there's so many of the things he does. I find it really interesting. One thing that I kind of was so shocked by when I learned about it was his working relationship with Johnny Vegas. Like, he's directed
Ah,
Johnny
yeah.
Vegas's shows and stuff. And you kind of think they are opposite ends of the comedy spectrum. Johnny Vegas, Larry, profane, drunk,
Mm.
uh, and yeah, like kind of base, but like he very much plays the fool in like like the Shakespearean sense of playing the fool almost. Uh,
Mm.
so yeah, like what did you? I mean, did you know about this working relationship, or kind of what qualities do you think that Stuart Lee can bring to that style of comedy?
I think I'd vaguely heard about it, but it doesn't surprise me because I've heard a lot of different professional comedians talk about Johnny Vegas, and almost without exception, people talk about Johnny Vegas as like one of the smartest comedians they've ever met.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
Mm-hmm.
and I think he's one of those people who has like a real skill for doing that like incredibly sort of profane stuff, but very well and in a way
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
sort of
It's
very
clowning,
like
isn't
subtly
it? To an
satirical.
extent, it's
Yeah.
clowning.
Um, and I think that, yeah, I think when you're being directed by someone, you kind of want to be directed by someone who thinks differently to you because you want them to add perspective to what you're doing. So
Yeah.
if you're kind of a clown, then you really want someone like Stuart Lee to be like adding that sort of more, I suppose you might say, intellectual or analytical element to it, and vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. I think if you're like already very like structured and analytical, I think it's quite good to have someone who has more of an eye for something else, be it physicality or um, even kind of a certain softness. Like I tend
Mm.
to, when I'm choosing a director, I tend to get someone who's more into like, I suppose, storytelling and like the emotional side of things, because I think my own stage persona can be quite hard edged, and it's sort of like but through a bit of softening through a kind of different perspective, it helps it a lot to come across better.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Well, there we go, Milo. That is your 5 guests. Do you want to sum them up for us? Remind us the 5 people you'd invite to your dinner party.
It's a memory test now. So we had. Was it Roger Moore first, or was it someone else first?
We had Steve Coogan
Steve
first.
Coogan first. Yeah. So,
What a guest.
Yeah, Steve,
then Roger Moore.
then Roger Moore, and then Osama bin Laden. Of course, the Fiesta Resistance.
Naturally, yeah.
100%. Miriam Margolyes, I think, sat next to bin Laden. I think the two of them would get on, actually.
Oh, I think there would be some frank exchanges that would be well worth sitting in on.
Yeah, 100%. And then, rounding it off with Stuart Lee. I think that's an ideal dinner party, really.
That is quite brilliant. And so we know that you're going to be in this very nice apartment in, was it Shoreditch?
Whitechapel, so not too far.
Whitechapel. Okay. So you're in Whitechapel with this eclectic group of people. And now we need to know, what are you serving up? So first of all, you say you like cooking. You're an enthusiastic cook.
I really like to cook. I think that I really like eating, and I think I sort of got into cooking that way. But we've always been a bit of a cooking household. My mum kind of taught us all to cook as kids, and
oh, great.
I sort of think that there is the way I divide good and bad cooking is essentially by sort of there's an aesthetic element to good cooking, right? Where I think that sort of people who have good taste in like interior design and music and things are probably quite good cooks, because you've got to be able to judge what you're doing and see and just look at it and be like, is that going to be good or not? So what I would be cooking would be a roast. Because I'm incredibly picky about a roast, but a good roast is like nothing else.
A good roast is so difficult to beat. So what's going in this roast?
So I think beef. I don't mind a lamb roast, but it can be a bit controversial with some people, a bit trickier to get right. And I think chicken is just a cop out. Like, come on, lads. If you're bothering to have a roast, I'm all about eating less red meat, but like when you're having a roast, it's got to be beef, right? Nice top side of beef. Fill it if you're feeling really fancy, right? Yeah, do it. I underdo mine as much as possible. There's nothing worse than overdoing beef. Kind of. I would say 100%. Yeah. So you've got your nice rare beef. Oh yeah. And then quality of joint, very important as well. Honestly, if you want a really good joint, Lidl Deluxe range, better than anything you'll buy in a regular supermarket.
Is that
so? That's a secret from me. Yeah,
Lidl.
The quality of fruit and vegetables and meat, particularly meat in Lidl, is astonishingly good. But especially when you're talking red meat, like the red meat in Tesco's crap. That's my. This is now the anti-Tesco podcast.
This is where the advertising began.
Exactly. So yeah, roast. Doing potatoes, kind of various sizes. I like to do mine in a bit of a mixture because you get the crispier ones, but also the meatier ones. I think it adds a nice balance. So boil them 5 minutes, shake them up, get them nice and fluffy. The oil I use kind of olive oil, like the lightest olive oil you can get. So you want cheap olive oil because it won't burn. Get it about half an inch deep in the pan. Like you cannot put too much oil in. A couple of spoonfuls of butter as well. Yeah. Get it hot in the oven, about 180, and then potatoes straight into like boiling hot oil. Put them in about an hour and a half, sometimes a bit less, depending on how many you're doing. Turn them every 20 minutes. The thing with roast potatoes is you've just got to really give them attention. If you keep turning them, you'll get beautifully all-round. Like, I've been served a white roast potato too many times, and I'm like, you can just look at that and know that it's a shit roast potato. Like, why did you take it out of the oven? It wasn't brown yet. It's a simple, like, some things are difficult to get right. Roast potatoes are not one of them. You just got to give them attention and leave them in long enough.
This is just music to my ears. I hate to play up to every Irish stereotype, but I could sit here and talk about potatoes all day.
Well, exactly. And something I differ with my mum on about a roast is my mum likes to do the roast potatoes in with the beef because she likes the kind of beef crust that you get on the potatoes, which is good. But the trouble with that is then you can't use the beef pan to make the gravy because it's full of oil. So I don't do that. I'm making gravy in the beef pan on the hob. I'm putting in a couple of stock cubes, some water, a bit of corn flour, lots of salt and pepper, maybe some spices if I'm feeling fancy. A friend of mine puts garam masala in gravy, and it's pretty good. Yeah,
That
it's
is
interesting, that, isn't it?
next level gravy. Garam masala.
Mm-hmm.
I am
Wild, isn't it?
trying this.
Exactly. Yeah, you can get quite creative with gravy. I think a lot of people are too conservative. Um,
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit of a coward when it comes to gravy, but yeah, maybe I need to loosen up. Have a drink before I make the gravy and then just get creatively free.
exactly. Just to make some jazz gravy, really riff your way through it. Um, so yeah, gravy, and then usually I'll do vegetables. I think are an area where British people really cop out on the roast. Like if you're
Hmm.
serving boiled vegetables, that's an issue for me. I think you want to do my ideal roast veg normally is I will do Brussels sprouts, but finely chopped, sautéed in a pan, olive oil and butter, salt and pepper, and then towards the end you stir in a whole grain mustard, maybe a little bit of parmesan.
Oh,
You get a kind
Milo, this is outstanding.
of
This is just
yeah.
brilliant news. I love a good sprout. I love to do them with like pancetta and chopped chestnuts.
Oh, very
It's
bougie.
really fun. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
That's a nice way to kind of pan fry them. But parmesan and what was the other thing you were putting in with the parmesan?
Whole grain mustard. Whole grain
Whole
mustard is
grain
really the key
mustard.
here. Parmesan you
Exquisite.
can leave in or out depending on. Probably with gravy, I wouldn't put the parmesan in actually. But if
Sure.
you're doing, they're quite a good accompaniment to steak as well. So in that case, definitely parmesan.
Oh yeah.
Mm.
Oh, this is wonderful. I mean, I think it's fair to say this meal is far nicer than what Osama bin Laden deserves. But
And
he'll
probably
be
what he
very
mostly
grateful
got.
for it, I'm sure.
Yeah. And then other veg. I'm quite a fan of roasted carrots, or even I don't
Yes.
mind a steamed carrot if you're doing them with parsley and butter. That's quite good. And
Mm.
also a roasted parsnip. I quite often do the parsnips in with the roast potato, so they're kind of like incredibly crisp, but with that sweetness in the middle.
Oh, I like that.
Delicious.
Yeah, I could get on board with that. I
Mm.
recently got introduced to roast broccoli, which was something I hadn't really done before, but it's
Yeah.
absolutely wonderful.
Mm.
I think you're
Yeah,
right.
no, it is quite
People
nice.
people kind of just think, oh, and you need some veg, and so they'll just boil it or steam it or whatever. But you are giving love to every area of this roast, and I have nothing but respect for it.
Well, thank you. I'm really a perfectionist when it comes to food. Also, as a starter, love to do roasted asparagus in pancetta.
Oh
Always a great
yes,
snack. Mm.
fantastic. That is truly wonderful. And do your guests, do they get a little something sweet at the end?
Well, I love dessert, but I don't really make dessert, so I would
Sure.
probably buy something. But it kind of depends how I'm feeling. Do you know a dessert I go back to all the time, and I think it's very underrated? Is a tiramisu.
Oh yeah, I've because I'm not a coffee drinker, I never get to enjoy a tiramisu.
Oh, okay. It's really it's an
It's a shame.
extremely good dessert. It's light yet tasty, and it has a certain kind of has a slight earthiness in it from the coffee and the masala. It's definitely it's got something about
Hmm.
it as a dessert.
It's something I don't like about myself that I don't like coffee. I've always had this idea that I would like to live in Italy at some point in my life, but obviously you
Mm.
can't. I don't think you're allowed to live in Italy if you don't drink coffee. So that's something I really need to improve on. Maybe tiramisu is my way in.
Yeah, well, I mean, I adore coffee, but I would say tiramisu might be a good gateway drug because it's coffee definitely contributes a lot to the flavor, but it doesn't taste of coffee, if you see what I mean. Coffee is more like
Yeah.
kind of an undertone in it.
Okay. Well,
You
this.
wouldn't necessarily pick it out as being coffee flavored if you didn't know, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think I'm gonna be getting. In fact, I just think I'm gonna be listening back to this on Sunday and trying to recreate this entire meal because it
It's a
sounds just
cook along
wonderful.
podcast.
And maybe I'll ask my wife to dress up as Osama or something, really recreate the experience. Uh,
Osama, can you just hand me the potatoes?
More broccoli,
Something,
Osama. It's an
yeah, something I
extraordinary
will
party
always.
I really want to be a part of.
Oh yeah, well that's what we're aiming for, right? Yeah, it's just reminded me of something I'll always credit my dad with was fairly shortly after 9/11 happened, he began referring to bin liners as Osamas, and didn't stop doing that until the day he died. So I mean, credit to the man. He sticks with the bit.
That is fantastic. I think I'm going to try to bring that into my household now as well.
Absolutely. I think
Milo,
spreading it is good.
this has been so much fun. Thank you so much.
It's
Could
been
you
a pleasure.
remind our lovely listeners? I mean, this is episode 1. I have no idea how many listeners I'm going to have for this. But if we want
More or less
to
than
hear
guests of the
more
dinner
of your
party.
work, could you remind us about your podcast and where we can check it out?
Yeah, I have a podcast. It's called Trash Future. It's sort of a left-wing comedy podcast. It's very weird, but mysteriously popular. And you can find me on Twitter at Milo_Edwards. I also have a podcast in Russian, which is called Dumach. And if you happen to speak Russian, maybe you want to check that out as well. They're all on Apple Podcasts and all the places where you might listen to a podcast.
All the places. That is fantastic. And Milo, I really hope that very soon we get to see you back performing at Jericho Comedy, because we really love having you there.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I'd love to do it.
Thank you so much, mate, for taking the time this afternoon to talk us through your dream dinner party. We'll speak again soon.
Fantastic. Cheers.
Cheers, mate. Bye-bye. Well, there we go. That was the dream dinner party of Milo Edwards, and it was a cracker. If you got this far with the podcast, hopefully that means you've enjoyed it. If that's the case, please like, subscribe, rate, share, all that stuff. Check back next week when my guest on the dinner party will be comedian and actor Suze Kempner. For now, if you want to follow any more of my podcast, radio, or comedy work, visit www.conormcreynolds.com. The Dinner Party was a Jericho Comedy production, and you can check out the Jericho Comedy podcast, a new episode every Monday, available wherever you get your podcasts. I'll see you next week, but for now, thanks for tuning in and bye-bye.